A hidden will. A shocking twist. A mystery only Hercule Poirot can solve. When Violet Marsh discovers her inheritance is missing, she turns to the world's greatest detective. But can Poirot find the will before it's too late? The estate stood in solemn silence, the shadows of ancient trees stretching long over the manicured lawns, as if guarding the secrets of the house itself. The sky overhead, a brooding gray, seemed to press down on the mansion's weathered stone walls, giving the impression that the very air within was heavy with unsaid words. The house was neat, orderly, but there was something unsettling about it, something that didn't quite belong. In the drawing room, the atmosphere was one of quiet tension, the kind that hangs thick in the air before a storm. The furniture, polished and prim, seemed to hold their place as though unwilling to stir. A single lamp cast a pool of light over Miss Violet Marsh, sitting across from Hercule Poirot, who was watching her with his usual calm, yet sharp attention. She was a striking woman, her eyes dark with worry, her posture betraying a certain strain beneath her composed exterior. She cleared her throat before speaking, as though to steady herself. "Mr. Poirot," she began, her voice steady but with an edge of something unspoken. "My uncle Andrew Marsh passed away last week. He was a man of peculiar habits. A man who made his fortune in Australia and returned to England with a mysterious past. And now, after his death, I find myself in possession of a will that contains an extraordinary condition." Poirot raised an eyebrow slightly, inviting her to continue, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of his chair. "My uncle," she went on, "forbade me from pursuing an education, a strange, almost obsessive request. And now, in his final will, he has left me with a testone that I must pass within a year to inherit his estate. The clause reads, 'Prove your wits, and all will be yours.'" Poirot's gaze grew sharper, his mind already turning over the implications of this strange condition. "Prove your wits," he repeated, almost to himself. "But how? What could your uncle mean by such a thing?" Violet hesitated, glancing down at the letter in her hands, as though unsure whether to share more. "That is what I don't understand, Mr. Poirot. I believe he may have hidden something within his estate, perhaps a second will, or even a treasure. But I don't know where to begin." Poirot leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "Ah, the mystery deepens. It is not often, Miss Marsh, that I encounter such a curious case. But I assure you, there is always a reason for every oddity, and often, the truth lies not where we expect it, but where it is most hidden." Violet leaned forward, her expression intense. "You believe there is something hidden in the estate, don't you? A clue, perhaps?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "I do not merely believe, Miss Marsh, I am certain of it, and I believe your uncle was not testing you, as you think. He was testing your ability to see beyond the obvious, to find the truth where others might overlook it. And so this test, you must pass it, may be a test of your mind, but more importantly, it is a test of your character." Violet sat back, digesting his words. "Then you will help me." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Of course, for I have a certain fondness for puzzle sand. This one, Miss Marsh, is one I intend to solve." A cold gust of wind howled outside the window, rattling the panes with an eerie sound. The storm, it seemed, had arrived, and with it, Poirot's new challenge. A challenge that would, without a doubt, unravel far more than just a simple test of wits. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot finished speaking, the door to the drawing room creaked open slightly, as though pushed by a draft. Violet's eyes snapped to the movement, her breath catching in her throat. But there was no one there, just the wind. Or was it? The investigation begins. The fog had settled thick over the estate, casting a muted gray hue over the sprawling grounds. As the car pulled up to the imposing mansion, Hercule Poirot stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape with characteristic calm. Captain Hastings, ever the loyal companion, followed, but his gaze was fixed on the house with a peculiar wariness. The large, dreary building loomed in front of them, its windows like unblinking eyes. There was something unsettling about the place, a stillness that hung in the air, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting. As Poirot surveyed the surroundings, he noticed the way the ivy curled around the stone walls, how the ivy seemed to be growing, too eagerly. The scene was quiet, too quiet, and the sense of something hidden, something not immediately visible, lingered at the edges of his mind. The housekeepers, Mr. and Mrs. Baker, greeted them at the door. The man, Mr. Baker, had a thin, strained smile, his eyes darting nervously between Poirot and the grand staircase that led into the house. Mrs. Baker, on the other hand, was composed but distant, her stern features betraying a hint of something that might have once been warmth now gone, replaced by the wear of years spent under the same roof. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," Mrs. Baker began, her voice just above a whisper. "I trust your journey was pleasant." Poirot nodded but did not speak immediately. He was studying her stiff posture, the slight tremor in her hand, as she reached to close the door behind them. Her nervousness was not lost on him. "We are at your service," Mr. Baker added. But his words seemed to have an edge to them, as if he too was on edge. The conversation drifted toward Andrew Marsh's will. Both housekeepers recounted how the late Andrew had torn up an earlier will in a fit of what seemed to be guilt, though neither could explain exactly why. It had been a mistake, they said, and the new will had been written shortly after. Strangely enough, it appeared to be free of any significant error, or so they claimed. Poirot's eyes, though calm, were alert, taking in every word, every gesture. His mind was a machine, clicking into gear with each detail that didn't quite align. Something was amiss. A housekeeper's gaze avoided his, the shifting of their eyes more telling than words. But Poirot said nothing. It was the smallest details that often led to the greatest revelations. As the conversation continued, Poirot's eyes drifted to a small, yet telling detail: a key. The housekeeper had mentioned the keys to various rooms, all carefully labeled, all except for one. The key to a roll-top desk, an insignificant mention in the grand scheme of things, perhaps, but Poirot's senses tingled. The key, unlike the others, was not attached to a neatly labeled tag. Instead, it was fastened to a yellowed envelope, the surface of which was coated in grime and dirt. It was clearly old, yet there was something about it, something that made Poirot's instincts scream. "Ah," Poirot murmured softly to himself as he reached for the key. "The key it is. Interesting, no?" "Ah, yes," Mr. Baker said quickly. "It's been there for years, never been used, to my knowledge. Only Mr. Marsh ever touched it, and then—" He faltered, perhaps realizing that his words were becoming too much. Poirot's eyes flickered back to the envelope. He didn't need to ask further. The clue had been laid before him, as delicate and deliberate as a spider's web. He could feel the invisible threads of mystery pulling at him. Later, Poirot and Hastings moved through the mansion, each room a reflection of Andrew Marsh's odd, solitary life. As they walked through the shadowed hallways, Poirot's sharp eyes took note of every detail: the faint drafts, the worn-out carpets, and the peculiar angles of the furniture. Nothing was out of place, yet something felt terribly out of sorts. They came to the drawing room, where a large fireplace dominated the far wall. Poirot stopped in front of it, running his eyes over the hearth with a patient deliberation. The bricks were too uniform, too carefully aligned. The slightest imperfection, though almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, caught Poirot's attention. There was something there, hidden beneath the centuries-old ash and soot. "Monday, ami," Poirot said to Hastings. "Do you see, there is a secret in this fireplace, not in the obvious ways, but in the very structure of it." "Could it be a hidden compartment?" Hastings asked, but Poirot only smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but nothing is ever that simple, is it, mon ami?" The investigation had only just begun, but Poirot could already feel the layers of deception, half-truths, and falsehoods, all waiting to be uncovered. He was no stranger to the games that people played with secrets, and yet this was something different. A test, a riddle, or something more sinister. As the two men stood in the room, Poirot's mind was already racing ahead. What was hidden in that desk? What lay beneath the ashes of the fireplace? The puzzle pieces had only just begun to fall into place, and Poirot knew that with each piece, the final image would be far more twisted than anyone could anticipate. Cliffhanger ending. The sudden, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps behind them made Poirot's eyes flicker to the door. The hairs on the back of Hastings' neck stood on end. The house was silent, save for the sound of their breathing, but Poirot knew instinctively that something was watching them. As Poirot turned to face the entrance, the door creaked open just a crack, and in the dim light, a figure appeared, silhouetted and indistinct. "Monday due," Poirot whispered, as the figure's shadow fell across the threshold, a grim forewarning of something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. "Is it him?" Hastings asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Poirot did not answer. His eyes remained fixed on the door, as if waiting for it to open again. But there was only silence. The suspects and the first twist. The house seemed to breathe as Poirot and Hastings made their way through the gloomy halls. The faintest echo of footsteps, too faint to be a sound made by anyone present, lingered in the silence. It was as if the house itself was alive with secrets. A small room adjoining the drawing room held a curious stillness, a place that felt out of place in a house so well kept. As Poirot stood before the fireplace, his mind seemed to hum with the same quiet tension that hung thick in the air. Poirot's keen eyes flickered over the objects in the room, though it was the housekeeper's accounts that continued to puzzle him. Mr. and Mrs. Baker, the only witnesses to the tearing of the previous will, had spoken of it with such peculiar detachment. They recounted Andrew Marsh's change of heart, as though they'd been mere observers in a matter of no consequence. Yet Poirot's intuition told him that there was more beneath the surface than either of them had let on. It was unsettling, the way they seemed to be glossing over key details with practiced ease. Why had they been chosen as the sole witnesses for such a significant alteration to the will? And why, Poirot wondered, had Andrew seemed so insistent on the matter? The question gnawed at him, like an itch in the back of his mind that he couldn't quite scratch. The two housekeepers' uneasy demeanor only added weight to Poirot's suspicions. Mr. Baker, though physically stout, carried an air of nervousness that was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Baker, on the other hand, was so composed that it bordered on the unnatural or rigid posture, her cold, calculated answers. There was something unnatural in the way they seemed to avoid direct eye contact with Poirot, almost as if they were hiding something from him, or worse, from each other. As Poirot stood there, his gaze once again returning to the fireplace, he felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. His mind was calculating, analyzing, sifting through the possibilities. The fireplace had intrigued him from the start. It was too perfect, too meticulously crafted, and that in itself was a clue. He could feel the hidden compartment beneath the thick stone, could almost imagine the sensation of unlocking its secrets. His eyes narrowed as he studied the surrounding bricks with a painter's precision. The design, once again, felt slightly off, the faintest irregularity noticeable to only the most discerning eye. Poirot's hands moved slowly as he carefully brushed the remaining ashes aside, revealing the remnants of something more. Bits of charred paper, remnants of what had once been a document. His fingers lingered on the broken fragments, the weight of their significance pressing upon him. "Ah," Poirot murmured quietly. "Voila, what do we have here?" Hastings, watching from the corner of the room, stepped closer, his curiosity piqued. What is it, Poirot?" Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. "A destroyed will, my friend. A will that was deliberately set alight, but not entirely consumed." Hastings blinked in surprise. "You're sure?" Poirot looked at him, the faintest glimmer of triumph in his gaze. "Absolutely. Only someone who knew that their actions would be examined carefully would have destroyed a will in such a manner, carefully, deliberately, and with a touch of care. It is the mark of a man with much to hide." As Poirot stood in front of the smoldering remains, something seemed to shift in the air. The room, once still and calm, now felt charged, tense. The quiet was broken only by the sound of Poirot's voice. "This, Hastings," he said quietly, is the first clue that all is not as it seems in this estate. I believe that Andrew Marsh was hiding something more than just his fortune. This will was not just a legal document, it was a key to understanding the motives of those who surround him. But Poirot knew, too, that there was something more beneath this first clue. He had not yet unlocked the full mystery. Suddenly there was a knock at the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of it creaking open. Both Poirot and Hastings turned. The door swung open slowly, as though moved by an unseen hand. In the doorway stood Mr. Baker, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. "Mr. Poirot," he said, his voice trembling. You must come quickly. There has been an incident." Before either man could speak, Mr. Baker stepped back, motioning them urgently forward. Poirot's gaze never left the housekeeper's face, studying the subtle tremor in his hand, the panicked flicker in his eyes. Poirot's mind raced with questions, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together, but only just enough to leave him with more uncertainty than answers. "Come, Hastings," Poirot said in a low voice, his eyes narrowing. "It seems we have another twist in our little game." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot and Hastings hurried to the source of the disturbance, the door to the estate creaked ominously behind them, as if something or someone was still waiting in the shadows. In the flickering hallway light, Poirot could swear he saw a shadow move just out of the corner of his eye. A sudden chill ran down his spine. "Poirot," Hastings whispered, his voice strained. "Do you feel that?" Poirot's answer was quiet, almost inaudible. "I feel that the game has just begun." The door to the drawing room slammed shut behind them. The Midpoint. A false lead. Poirot and Captain Hastings, with heavy hearts, drove away from the grand estate, their minds tangled in knots. The estate, its creaking walls and heavy silence had revealed little more than frustration. Poirot's brow was furrowed, a rare sight for those who knew him well. He leaned back against the plush seat of the car, staring out into the blur of the passing countryside, his fingers tapping a steady rhythm on the leather-bound briefcase at his side. "Monday, Ami," Hastings ventured, his voice breaking the oppressive quiet. "Do you think we've missed something? Perhaps something we overlooked in the house?" Poirot did not respond immediately, his mind still dwelling on the various details. The torn-up will, the strange note, the odd keys. There was a sense of something unresolved, something just beyond reach. "Poirot," Hastings pressed again. Poirot's hand froze mid-tap, his piercing gaze suddenly focused, as if a sudden realization had struck him like a thunderclap. "The envelope," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. "What envelope?" Hastings asked, puzzled. "That filthy, soiled envelope attached to the roll-top desk key. There is something more to it, mon ami." Poirot's voice had regained its usual firmness, his mind shifting into full investigative mode once again. "I had dismissed it earlier, but now it nags at me." Without further explanation, Poirot instructed Hastings to turn the car around. Hastings, though perplexed, did as instructed, his foot pressing down on the brake, the car swerving back toward the estate. The return. The house stood like a silent sentinel against the encroaching night as Poirot and Hastings entered once more. The air was thick with expectation. The housekeepers, Mr. and Mrs. Baker, had long since retired to their quarters, leaving Poirot and Hastings alone. Poirot wasted no time. He immediately approached the fireplace, his eyes scanning the room with sharp precision. "Monday, Ami," Poirot said, addressing Hastings as he motioned toward the hearth. "There is one last thing we must examine." A fire crackled in the large fireplace, its warmth casting flickering shadows across the room. Poirot bent over the fireplace, his brow slightly furrowed. "The ashes," he muttered, almost to himself. Poirot's voice was calm, but there was an underlying determination in his words. He knew what he had to do. With the graceful movements of a man with a purpose, Poirot took the grimy envelope, the one he had earlier dismissed, as insignificant, and gingerly placed it near the flames. As the fire licked the edges of the envelope, something strange began to happen. The paper seemed to shimmer, the grime and dirt vanishing like mist under the heat. Slowly, with dramatic slowness, invisible ink began to appear. Hastings watched in awe as the words began to form. Poirot's eyes gleamed with an intensity that only came when a crucial piece of the puzzle slid into place. "The true will," Poirot whispered. "The second will." Twist unveiled. As the last traces of the invisible ink became visible, Poirot carefully examined the document. His expression was unreadable, but the gleam in his eyes told Hastings everything he needed to know. The envelope revealed the truth. The will was dated after the one Violet had received, and it contained a shocking revelation. All of Andrew Marsh's estate was to be passed on to Violet. It was her inheritance by right, without condition or test. Poirot let out a deep sigh, his usual calm now tinged with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He turned to Hastings, his voice steady but laced with the excitement of discovery. "You see, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice lowering, "Andrew Marsh had written 2 copies of the first will. One he kept, the other he deliberately destroyed. He did not wish to simply leave his wealth to Violet. He wanted her to prove her worth, to test her wits, as it were." Hastings was still processing the information, his mind struggling to keep pace with the revelations unfolding before him. "And yet," Poirot continued, "Andrew's test was more complex than it first appeared. Violet did not have to outwit him, she only had to ask for help. By seeking me out, she has already passed the test." Hastings blinked, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "But—" "Ah," Poirot interrupted, holding up his hand. "The condition of the will was simple. Violet needed help to solve the puzzle. She needed to seek assistance to outwit her uncle's hidden intentions, and by coming to me she has proven herself worthy. It was not her intelligence alone that would have secured the estate, but her ability to realize when she could no longer rely on herself alone." Poirot's gaze softened for a moment as he looked at the will, now fully revealed. The challenge, mon ami, was never for Violet to figure out the mystery alone, but to know when to ask for help. Cliffhanger ending. But as Poirot's fingers lightly touched the will, a slight noise came from the hallway, a soft creak of wood on wood, as if someone was listening in on their conversation. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the door. "Do you hear that?" Hastings whispered, a chill running down his spine. Poirot smiled gently but with an edge of warning. "It seems, Hastings, the game is far from over." The door slowly creaked open. Who was there? Who else was involved in this carefully laid game of deception? And more importantly, was this the end of the mystery or merely the beginning? The answer would only reveal itself in time, as the shadows grew longer and the night deeper. The final reveal. The grand drawing room felt like a place caught between 2 worlds, the soft amber glow of the fire, painting shadows on the walls, while the deep, oppressive darkness of the night beyond the curtain seemed to be pressing in, eager to overtake the space. The air was thick, as though it could barely hold the weight of the conversation taking place. Poirot stood motionless, his eyes locked onto Violet's, his posture unwavering yet somehow fluid, like a man who understood the delicate balance between confidence and humility. It was a stillness that seemed to demand respect, to demand silence as the truth unfurled. Violet, on the other hand, was a bundle of barely contained energy. Her gaze darted from Poirot's face to the papers in front of her, the will, the envelope, the final pieces of the puzzle her uncle had left for her to solve. Her fingers trembled, but she kept them firmly clasped in front of her, gripping the edges of the table for some semblance of control. The weight of the moment, the culmination of weeks of investigation, uncertainty, and revelation hung in the balance. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat, she wasn't sure if she was ready for the truth that Poirot was about to deliver. She had followed his every lead, deciphered the hidden meanings in the cryptic messages, and faced down her own fears. But there was still one question, one piece of the puzzle that remained frustratingly out of reach. Poirot, as if sensing her inner turmoil, took a slow, deliberate step forward. He was close now, close enough for Violet to see the faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. His voice broke the silence, soft but firm, with the kind of certainty that only came from someone who knew they were about to impart something that would change everything. "Mademoiselle Violet, the estate is rightfully yours," he said, his words ringing clear and true. There was no hesitation in his tone, no doubt. And yet, something about the way he said it, almost as though it was a statement rather than a revelation, made her stomach tighten with unease. Violet's breath caught in her throat. Her heart skipped a beat as her mind scrambled to process the weight of Poirot's words. The estate, her uncle's legacy, was hers. But how? She reached instinctively for the papers on the table, the very documents that had held the answers she had been searching for. She had already uncovered the truth behind the willet's hidden ink, its cryptic clues, but even now, a small voice in her head whispered that there was more to this than met the eye. There was something about this moment, something about Poirot's calm demeanor, that felt almost too perfect, too simple. She had solved the riddle, uncovered the hidden truths, and yet there was still something missing. Poirot, sensing her confusion, leaned in slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. He spoke again, his voice low but unyielding. "Yes, the estate is yours, but it is not because of the will, Mademoiselle Number. It is because of your own cleverness that you are the rightful heir." Her heart raced as a rush of understanding began to wash over her. Cleverness. It was a word she had never expected to hear in relation to this inheritance. She had thought the will, the hidden messages, and the riddle were the keys to unlocking her fate. But now Poirot was telling her it was something more. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they still didn't make sense. What did he mean? Poirot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that came with the satisfaction of knowing you had seen the full picture when others were still fumbling in the dark. He took a step closer, the firelight casting a soft glow on his face. His gaze was steady, unflinching, as he spoke again, his words deliberately chosen, almost as though he were laying the final stone in a carefully constructed foundation. "You see, madame," Poirot continued, his voice now a mere whisper of what it had been before. "It was never the will itself that would prove your inheritance. It was the act of seeking the truth, the pursuit of knowledge, that truly proved you worthy. Andrew did not wish for you to simply find his will. He wanted to see how you would respond to the test. You to simply find his will. He wanted to see how you would respond to the test." Violet stood frozen, her breath shallow as her mind raced to keep up with Poirot's revelation. It wasn't just about solving the riddles her uncle had left behind. It was about something far deeper, something that transcended the material. Character, integrity. Her uncle's game hadn't been about intelligence alone, but about testing her ability to look beyond the surface, to seek the truth even when it wasn't immediately apparent, to ask for help when needed, and to not give up. Her uncle had given her the tools to uncover a deeper truth, not just about the estate, but about herself. "And you, Violet," Poirot continued, his voice steady and sure, "passed it not through your intelligence alone, but through your ability to ask for help, to look beyond the surface, to uncover what was hidden beneath the obvious." In that moment, Violet understood. It wasn't the wealth, nor the land, nor even the legacy of Andrew Marsh that she had inherited. What she had truly inherited was the wisdom to understand that answers were rarely as simple as they seemed. They were hidden beneath layers, and one had to have the courage to peel those layers back, no matter how uncomfortable it became. She felt a strange peace settle over her, the tension in her shoulders slowly unwinding. But before she could gather her thoughts, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle echoed through the room. It was a faint sound, so subtle that for a moment, Violet wondered if it had been her imagination. But Poirot, ever alert, stiffened imperceptibly. His sharp eyes flickered toward the door, his senses instantly aware of something unseen. The calmness in his face shifted to a sharpness, as though he had sensed something approaching. Violet's pulse quickened, her mind racing once more. They were not alone. But who else could be in the house at this hour? Who else had been watching, waiting, perhaps even manipulating events from the shadows? Poirot's eyes never left the door. The moment of revelation had passed, but a new mystery had just begun. The irony. Poirot's lips curved into a subtle smile, one so faint, so delicately measured, that it could easily be missed by anyone who wasn't paying close attention. His eyes, however, held a different story. There was something in his gaze, glint of knowing, a quiet amusement as though he were both an observer and a player in a game whose final move was fast approaching. "It is not the will, madame," Poirot said, his voice smooth, each word deliberate and precise, like a master painter laying down the final strokes of a masterpiece. "That proves your inheritance. It is your own cleverness in seeking the truth that seals it." The words hung in the air, thick with irony, as though Poirot were playing a game within a game. The room felt colder now, despite the crackling warmth of the fire. His declaration, seemingly so simple, was weighted with layers of meaning that Violet had yet to fully grasp. She could feel the tension in her chest, the unease tightening with every second. Violet's mind, still reeling from the revelations of the past few minutes, suddenly felt as though it were spinning. Her uncle's intentions, the puzzles he had laid out, and Poirot's cryptic words, nothing was as it seemed. Her fingers twitched, aching to reach for the will again, to trace the lines of the words that had started it all. But no, the real puzzle was far more intricate than a simple document. It was about trust, about the ability to see through the layers of deception and uncover what lay beneath the surface. But why? Why had her uncle wanted her to go through all of this? As these thoughts swirled in her mind, Violet couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the room. A subtle change that sent a chill down her spine. She glanced at Poirot. His expression was unchanged, his posture still impeccably composed, but there was a slight shift in his demeanor now. His gaze flicked, ever so briefly, toward the door, an almost imperceptible movement that suggested he was waiting for something, or someone. The silence between them stretched out, thick and pregnant with expectation. Violet's heart beat louder now, her pulse quickening as the seconds ticked by. She could feel her breath quicken, a knot forming in her stomach. Whatever Poirot was waiting for, she knew it was more than just a piece of the puzzle. It was the missing link, the one thing that would either unravel everything she thought she understood, or shatter it completely. Poirot's voice broke the silence once more, low and deliberate. "You see, Violet, Andrew's test, this attempt to hide the truth, has only revealed something far more important." He paused, his eyes never leaving the door, his voice growing more somber. "It has revealed your worth, Violet. The test was never about proving your wit. It was about proving your ability to uncover the truth, even when it is hidden behind layers of deception." Violet's thoughts tumbled over each other, the weight of Poirot's words settling deep within her. Her worth. She had thought the puzzle was about intellect, about solving riddles and cracking codes. But her uncle, it seemed, had wanted to test something much more essential, her ability to see, to trust her instincts, to not simply rely on the obvious answers, but to question everything and look for what was hidden beneath the surface. The layers of this mystery were deeper than she had ever imagined. What had begun as a simple search for a missing will had turned into a profound lesson about trust, deception, and truth. The truth was not something that could be found on the surface. It was something that had to be earned, uncovered, and understood with the deepest part of one's soul. And then, just as she thought she might unravel the final thread, the tension in the room escalated. Poirot's expression remained unchanged, his eyes still fixed on the door, his hand subtly inching toward his pocket watch. There was something in the air, something almost tangible, as though the room were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Violet's heart raced, her mind struggling to process the mounting tension. She was no longer sure of anything except one thing. Someone was coming. Someone was about to step into the room and bring with them a new layer of this dark, intricate mystery. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sense that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow. And then it happened. The door, already slightly ajar, creaked open with a slow, deliberate sound, as though the very house were reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. A figure stepped into the doorway, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light of the room. The figure was tall, their shape concealed by the shadows, the darkness clinging to them like a cloak. For a moment they seemed to pause, as though waiting for the perfect moment to reveal themselves. Poirot's eyes narrowed, But there was no surprise in his gaze, only quiet anticipation. His hand remained near his pocket watch, poised as if he were preparing for something. Violet's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words died in her mouth. She knew that this moment would change everything, that this figure, whoever they were, held the final key to the mystery. The room fell into an almost suffocating silence. Violet could hear the faintest sounds of her own breathing, the crackling fire, and the soft rustle of the figure's clothing as they took a step forward. Each movement seemed calculated, measured, nothing hasty, nothing rushed. The presence of this person seemed to hang in the air like a storm cloud, its contents unknowable. Poirot's hand, still hovering near his pocket watch, remained unmoving, but his eyes locked onto the figure with an intensity that bordered on expectation. It was as if Poirot already knew who this person was, or at least what they were about to reveal. Violet's heart was in her throat now, her mind racing with questions. Who was this person? What did they want? What had they been waiting for all this time? And most importantly, what was the final truth that even Poirot, with all his skill and insight, hadn't yet uncovered? The answer was tantalizingly close, just out of reach. The final layer of deception was about to be peeled away. But not yet. Not until this mysterious figure revealed themselves completely. The silence in the room thickened, and with each passing moment, the air seemed to grow heavier. The figure stepped closer, their face still obscured in shadows, but Violet could feel the weight of their gaze upon her, as though they knew everything about her. About the journey she had taken, the revelations she had uncovered. And yet, there was still more to this story, there was still more to learn. And as the figure moved into the room, Violet knew that the game was far from over. Conclusion and reflection. The grand mansion, once a haven of mystery and whispered secrets, now stood in haunting silence. The echoes of hurried footsteps, the rustle of papers, and the sharp exchanges of wit had all faded into the past. The once thick tension had dissipated, leaving behind only the stillness of a truth finally unearthed. The remnants of the investigation lay scattered in the room, half-finished thoughts, solved riddles, and the final pieces of a puzzle that had once seemed insurmountable. Poirot stood in front of the grand fireplace, the flickering flames casting long, restless shadows across the room. His posture was composed, his gaze distant, as though the resolution of the case had not fully settled in his mind. His fingers grazed the rim of his pocket watch absently, the steady ticking of time offering no comfort. The case was over. The truth had been revealed. Yet something lingered, something intangible, like a faint scent in the air, drifting just out of reach, refusing to be dismissed. Beside him, Captain Hastings stood, his broad frame leaning slightly against the polished marble mantel, his expression a mix of relief and lingering curiosity. He had witnessed Poirot's methodical unraveling of the tangled web of lies and deceit, always a few steps behind his friend's brilliant mind. But now, with the final revelation in the air, and the mystery at an end, Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye, something deeper that had gone unnoticed. The fire crackled softly, its warmth a stark contrast to the coolness of the room. But still, Poirot remained lost in thought. Finally, it was as though the silence demanded a response, and Poirot spoke, his voice softer than usual, carrying an undercurrent of reflection, almost as though he were speaking not just to Hastings, but to himself. "You see, Hastings," Poirot began, his words deliberate, measured, "it is not always the most obvious that holds the truth. Often, it is buried beneath layershitten, beneath arrogance, pride, or even fear." Hastings, who had been staring into the flickering flames, turned toward his friend, his brow furrowing in confusion. He knew Poirot well enough by now to understand that these were not just the words of a detective wrapping up a case. No, Poirot had a way of contemplating life itself, and in this moment he seemed to be searching for something beyond mere answers. "But Poirot," Hastings ventured, his voice uncertain yet eager, "Violet is the rightful heir. The will was clear in the end, wasn't it?" Poirot did not immediately respond, and for a long moment the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire, its warmth at odds with the tension in the air. Then, Poirot turned slowly, his eyes meeting Hastings with a steady, almost piercing gaze. There was a quiet power in that gaze, a depth that spoke volumes without the need for words. "Yes," Poirot said, his voice carrying a trace of irony. "Yes, the will was clear, but it was not the will itself that intrigued me, Hastings. No, it was the people, their actions, their choices. People like Andrew. People who believe that intelligence is something that can be controlled, manipulated." Poirot paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though considering the weight of his own thoughts. "They underestimate others. They think that by hiding the truth they can dictate the outcome. But they fail to understand one thing, mon ami." Hastings shifted, his gaze never leaving Poirot, his mind racing to keep up with his friend's deeper reflections. He had known Poirot for years, had seen him unravel the most complex of mysteries with ease, but this felt different. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about something far more profound. Poirot took a slow, deliberate step forward, the quiet of the room amplifying the sound of his polished shoes against the hardwood floor. The weight of the moment seemed to settle over them both. Poirot's voice, calm and steady, broke the silence once more. "Wisdom, true wisdom, does not hide itself. It is always there, waiting to be uncovered, sometimes in the most unlikely of places. It may be masked by vanity, by arrogance, or by fear of being seen for what it truly is." Poirot paused, his eyes now focused intently on Hastings, his expression solemn. "But in the end, Hastings, it always reveals itself, even when it seems lost or forgotten." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the quiet weight of Poirot's words. Hastings stood motionless, processing the depth of his friend's statement. He had seen countless cases unfold before him, each with its own set of twists and turns. But this case had revealed something far more human than he had expected. It wasn't just about solving the crime. It was about peeling back the layers of deception and uncovering what lay hidden beneath. Hastings's mind wandered back to the key moments of the investigation, the subtle clues, the twists in the story, and most of all, the people involved. He thought of Violet's determination, her perseverance, and her unexpected wisdom. The way she had uncovered the truth, not just through intellect, but through a deeper understanding of human nature. And in the end, it wasn't just about her uncle's estate or the inheritance, it was about something far more lasting. Her ability to seek out the truth, no matter where it led. Poirot's gaze softened, his voice quieter now. "It is often the most hidden truths that shape us, Hastings. Not the ones we seek in the obvious places, but the ones we must dig for, deep inside ourselves. Those are the truths that matter. Those are the ones that change us." Hastings took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful as he absorbed Poirot's words. He had come to admire Poirot's methods, but in this moment, he realized that there was more to Poirot than just being a brilliant detective. Poirot was a man who understood that the world was filled with complexities far beyond the surface, complexities that could not always be solved with logic alone. As the last flickers of the fire cast long shadows across the room, Hastings couldn't help but feel that the true mystery had never been the case itself. The mystery had always been about the people, their choices, their fears, their desires, and how they shaped the world around them. And in the end, perhaps the greatest truth of all was this, that wisdom, no matter how hidden, always found its way to the surface. Poirot turned, his face thoughtful, his eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. The case was over. The final layers of deception had been peeled away. And yet, in the stillness of the grand mansion, something remained, something unspoken, something deeper than any puzzle. The truth, as always, had revealed itself, and in doing so, it had left them both with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain, the game, in its own way, had never truly ended. Hastings stood quietly, his expression thoughtful, absorbing Poirot's words. He had witnessed Poirot solve case after case, but never had he heard such a profound reflection on the nature of human intelligence. The detective's words resonated deeper than any mystery they had ever solved. This case, in some ways, had been more about understanding the people involved than about solving the crime itself. Poirot continued, his tone now tinged with a sense of finality, yet also with a certain melancholy. The truth about the will, about Violet, it was never about who was smarter, who could outwit the other. It was about who was willing to look beneath the surface and see the world as it truly is: complex, messy, and often deceiving. The room seemed to grow colder, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air. Hastings, for once, remained silent, allowing his friend's insight to wash over him. There was something about Poirot's words that made him question everything he thought he knew. What if, like Violet, the answers had been in front of them all along, hidden, not in the actions of the suspects, but in the way they all viewed themselves? Poirot paused, his gaze turning to the window, where the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the darkness. And yet, Hastings, Poirot mused quietly, there is always another layer, another truth still to be uncovered. One must never grow complacent. Hastings raised an eyebrow. You mean, Poirot, that the story isn't over, that there's still something more? Poirot smiled, his usual calm and collected demeanor never faltering. In this world, Hastings, there is always more. One must never stop asking the questions. For the truth, my friend, is rarely what it seems. Suddenly, as if to punctuate his words, the door creaked open. A faint shadow loomed in the doorway. Someone or something had returned. Poirot's face remained impassive, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, sharpened once again. The mystery, it seemed, was far from over. Hastings turned to the door, tension tightening in the air. Poirot. Who could it be now? Poirot's gaze never wavered from the doorway. He stood frozen for a moment, his fingers moving ever so slightly over his watch chain. Before he spoke, his voice steady but with an edge of excitement. Ah, mon ami, the game is not yet finished. It never truly is. And as the shadow in the doorway grew clearer, a final, unsolved question lingered in the room. What did this mysterious presence mean for Poirot and for Violet? The answer would come, but not now, not yet. And as the door slowly creaked open wider, one thing was certain: the next twist was already in motion. Cliffhanger, ending. The sound of footsteps echoed, growing closer. Was it another player in the game? Or perhaps the return of someone thought to be gone for good? Poirot's smile deepened, the tiniest flicker of excitement in his eyes. The real question was, who would be left standing when the final truth came to light?